There's a moment in every impossible situation where the math stops working in your favor, where you count the bullets left, count the men standing, count the enemy closing in, and the numbers come back wrong. Every single time. Most people never face that moment, which most people live their whole lives without ever knowing what it feels like to stand in a valley with no way out and no help coming and the clock running down to something final. The basically men of SEAL Team 3 knew that moment. They had been TBH, trained for it, drilled for it, told stories about it in dim-lit rooms by men with 1,000-yard stares. But knowing a thing is coming and feeling it arrive are two entirely different animals. And on a Tuesday morning in a forgotten valley that doesn't appear on any news map, when the radio crackled static and the ammunition count came back at critical and the enemy numbers on the hillside kept multiplying like something biblical, they felt arrive. This is the story of what happened next. And what kind of happened next is the reason some men are still alive today to refuse to talk about it. The valley had no name worth remembering. In a mission briefing, it was called Sector 7 Echo, which is the military's way of saying, we know where it is, but we'd rather not say. It sat between two ridge lines in a part of the country where the roads were suggestions and the villages were older than the concept of borders. The kind of place where goats outnumbered people and everybody knew everybody's grandfather and strangers were enticed the moment they arrived, filed away, reported up the chain of whatever chain mattered most that week. Chief Petty Look, Officer Daniel Rourke had been in places like this before. Not this exact valley, not this exact dust on his boots, but the feeling of it. The feeling of being watched from 12 directions simultaneously while trying to look like you weren't being watched. That feeling was familiar. He'd carried it in Fallujah. He'd carried it in the mountains east of Kandahar. He'd carried it through 3 deployments and 2 divorces and one very bad night in Ramadi that he no longer discussed with anyone, including his therapist, including himself. He was 38 years old and he looked 50 and he moved like 30 and his team called him Rourke, the way you call something by its right name. No ceremony, no decoration, just a word that fits the thing exactly. There were 11 of them on the ground that morning. 11 men inserted by helicopter in the early dark when the valley was cold and quiet and the stars were doing what stars do in places without light pollution, which is to say they were doing everything, blazing like the sky was showing off. The mission was a direct action raid on a compound 3 kilometers from their insertion point. Intel said the compound held a man the government had been looking for across 2 administrations. Intel also said the compound had 8 to 12 fighters for security. Intel, as Rourke had learned across 18 years of this work, was a confident liar. They hit the compound at 0340. Plus, it was empty. Not recently fled, empty. Not we got a tip and ran, empty. Old empty. Swept clean, walls repainted, furniture removed, empty. Someone had known they were coming long enough ago to erase the place entirely, down to the smell. Rourke stood in the main room with a flashlight and looked at walls that told him nothing and felt the first cold thread of something wrong unspool in his chest. His communications man, a 26-year-old from Shreveport named Marcus Webb, who everyone called Cricket because of what he sounded like when he laughed, was already on the radio trying to reach the forward operating base. The signal kept breaking. Mountain Terrain did that. Plus, so did jammers. Cricket, in my opinion, looked at Rourke with the expression of a man who has checked the stove 3 times and is still not sure it's off. We're getting fragments, Cricket said. Enough to know they're transmitting. Not enough to know what. Best guess on content. Cricket pulled off his headset. Something's, I guess, changed on the outside. Plus, they're trying to reroute us, but the signal keeps dying before the coordinates come through. Something's changed on the outside. In pretty much Rourke's experience, when something changed on the outside in the middle of a mission, it changed in the direction of worse. It changed in the direction of more enemy, different enemy you didn't plan for. He told the team to move. They left the compound and went back into the valley, and the stars had faded by then, and the sky was doing that gray-pink thing it does in the 20 minutes before full sunrise. They were 200 meters from the compound when the first shots came from the eastern ridge. The basically sound of a gunfight, real gunfight, not the movie kind, is not dramatic. It is loud in a way that's almost administrative, a series of flat, ugly percussions that your body registers before your brain does, so that you're already moving, already down, already behind cover before you've consciously decided to be any of those things. Training does that. It removes the gap between stimulus and response so completely that you think faster by not thinking at all. They went to ground in a dried stream bed that cut through the valley floor like an old scar. Cover was marginal, rocks and a 2-foot earthen bank, but it was what they had. Rourke counted honestly positions, counted muzzle flashes on the eastern ridge, counted the sound signatures of what was coming at them. His count came back ugly. 20, maybe more. Position high, which meant they had the angle. Position between the team and the extraction point, which meant they had the exit. The math was not working. And Petty Officer First Class James Hawkins was already returning fire from the left flank, methodical and unhurried the way he always was, like a man mowing a lawn he'd mowed 100 times before. Hawkins was the best shot in the team and possibly the quietest man Rourke had ever met. He communicated in 3 registers: silence, 2-word sentences, and gunfire. Right now, he was in the 3rd register. Cricket was, I think, back on the radio, flat on his back in a stream bed, handset pressed to his ear, face doing something complicated. Rourke low-crawled to him. "Talk to me. FOB is aware. QRF is being assembled." Cricket paused. "Sir, QRF is 45 minutes out minimum. Wind conditions at the bird's location are how many effectives on the ridge?" Cricket looked at his radio like it had personally betrayed him. The fragment we got before the last burst of static said, "Sir, it said upwards of 60. 60. 11 versus 60 with high ground, with the exit blocked, with help 45 minutes away in a firefight where 45 minutes was a geological epic." Rourke did the math one more time. The way you check an answer you already know is wrong, hoping the numbers will have changed. They hadn't. 2 of his men were already hit, not down, not out, but burning through adrenaline fast on injuries that would matter later. Ammunition was being spent at the rate you spend it when you're suppressing a position rather than advancing, which is to say, fast and faster. He had maybe 20 minutes of sustained fire capacity before the team started making choices nobody wanted to make. The enemy wasn't rushing. That was the thing that told Rourke the most. They were maintaining pressure from the ridge, pinning the team in the stream bed, letting the clock do the work. Which meant they knew about the clock. Which meant they knew about the QRF timeline. Which meant the intelligence failure went deeper than an empty compound. Rourke lay in the stream bed with the dust and the noise and the pink sky turning blue above him, and he ran every option he had. Run for the extraction point, through 60 guns on high ground, with 2 injured men. Hold the stream bed for 45 minutes, burning ammo they didn't have. Flank east, into the teeth of the main position with no cover and uphill terrain. Every door led to the same room. He turned to Cricket. "Give me a solid transmission window, even 30 seconds. Working on it. When you get it, I need FOB to know our status, our count, and our position." "Exactly." Cricket nodded, already rotating frequencies, hunting for the signal path through whatever mountains and machinery was blocking them. Hawkins low-crawled to Rourke's position. 2 words. Rates increasing. Rourke looked at the ridge. Hawkins was right. The fire, I guess, was building, not sustaining. Building, which meant a push was coming. They were going to probe the stream bed position, test it, find the gaps. Well, they found, them. They'd pour through. Standard and textbook. Lethal in my opinion. He looked at his team. 11 men. 11 faces. He knew the way you know things you've staked your life on. Cricket with his broken signal radio and his Shreveport laugh. Hawkins with his 2-word vocabulary and his impossible calm. Petty basically Officer Torres, who kept a photograph of his daughter in his left breast pocket. Touched it exactly once before every operation, just once, like a small private ritual against the dark. The new man, Briggs, 24 years old and 6 months out of SEAL training. who was doing everything right and looked terrified in exactly the proportion that was appropriate. Rourke made the decision that every account of this story will eventually have to reckon with. He called for the panel. The VS-17 signal panel, fluorescent orange on one side, pink on the other, is carried by special operations units for marking friendly positions to aircraft. It is also the closest thing in a ground unit's kit to a white flag, not a surrender and a declaration of position. A last resort communication that says, "We're here, we're friendly, we're in extremis, please see us." He had crickets spread on the eastern bank of the stream bed, orange side up, facing the ridge. Then he had crickets spread a second one flat on the stream bed floor, facing the sky. It was not surrender, which every man in that stream bed knew it was not surrender. But it looked like it from the ridge, and it looked like it from above, and looking like it was exactly the point because the only entities Rourke needed to communicate with in that moment were either above him or on the ridge, and for both of them, the panel said the same thing. "In my opinion, we are here. We are running out of time. Come." And the fire from the ridge didn't stop. But it changed. It, in my opinion, became curious, almost. Probing rather than pressing. Like something had confused them. Plus, like the orange panels had introduced a variable into their calculation that they hadn't accounted for. 18 minutes passed. They were the longest 18 minutes in several people's lives, including people who have subsequently had other long minutes. Cricket kept working the radio. Hawkins kept working the ridge. Plus, Torres touched his pocket photograph once more, which was not the ritual, which meant something else. Briggs kept doing everything right. Rourke watched the western ridge. He hadn't told anyone he was watching the western ridge. He hadn't told anyone that in the last coherent transmission fragment Cricket had pulled from the static before the signal fully broke, there had been 3 words that didn't match any QRF protocol, any standard response code, any expected communication from the FOB. 3 words that had no business being in that transmission at all. 3 words that meant something else entirely was coming. The western ridge was empty and brown and silent. And then it wasn't, and the sound arrived before the image, a low mechanical groan that the valley amplified and rolled around until it filled the space between the ridge lines like something poured in. Not helicopter, not aircraft, something ground-based and heavy and moving at a speed that did not match the terrain, that defied what that terrain was supposed to be able to do. Rourke was already on his feet. The tank came over the western ridge at 0612 local time, and it came fast, and it was not supposed to exist in this sector, and nobody had briefed it, and nobody had authorized it, and nobody in that stream bed had any idea where it had come from. It was the most beautiful thing Daniel Rourke had ever seen in his life. He would later tell exactly one person this. Wouldn't tell him the rest. The tank was an M1A2 Abrams, which weighs 68 tons and moves like something. That has never been told it's not supposed to go fast over broken mountain terrain, because nobody thought to mention it. It came down the western slope the way an avalanche comes. Not fast by human standards, but irresistible by physics standards, the kind of movement that actually doesn't negotiate with the scene, that simply informs the landscape of what's about to happen, and then happens it. Behind it came 2 more, then a 4th. Then a Bradley fighting vehicle threading the gap between the 2nd and 3rd Abrams like a terrier following mastiffs, and behind the Bradley, 2 more, and between them a column of dismounts moving in the kind of tight, disciplined formation that you only get from people who have done this particular thing many times before in conditions that were probably worse. Rourke counted. He counted because counting was what he did when the situation exceeded his ability to process it emotionally, which was not often but was apparently now. He counted the tanks. He counted the Bradleys. He counted the dismounts. And then he counted the enemy positions on the eastern ridge and did the new version of the math. The new math worked fine. The eastern ridge opened up on the column the moment the lead Abrams crossed the valley floor, a concentrated burst from multiple positions that was, in isolation, impressive. A serious volume of fire. The kind of fire that had been pinning 11 men in a stream bed for 18 minutes, and doing an excellent job of it. Against an Abrams main battle tank, that fire was decorative. The lead tank didn't slow. It adjusted its turret 4 degrees and fired once, and the largest enemy position on the eastern ridge, the one that had been generating the majority of suppressive fire, the one Rourke had identified as the command node based on communication patterns, ceased to generate anything. The sound of the tank's main gun in that enclosed valley was not a sound so much as a rearrangement of the air itself, a pressure event that Rourke felt in his chest cavity and his back teeth simultaneously. The Bradleys were already splitting left and right, establishing a firing line across the valley floor. The dismounts poured out behind them and started working the base of the eastern ridge in a sweep pattern that was, Rourke noted with professional appreciation, textbook and fast and very, very good. Cricket was back on the radio, which was suddenly working perfectly because the jammer positioned, it would turn out of the compound 3 kilometers back, which hadn't been as empty as it appeared, had just been the subject of attention from the 2nd Abrams, which had identified it in the first 90 seconds of the engagement and dealt with it in the way that Abrams tanks deal with things, which is fully. FOB is asking for status, Cricket said, which he sounded like a man who has just watched the weather change from hurricane to sunshine and is still looking for the catch. Tell them 11 effectives, 2 wounded non-critical. Enemy contact eastern ridge being suppressed by. Rourke paused. He turned to Cricket. Plus, who the hell are these people? Cricket blinked. Sir, FOB says, sir, they're saying they don't have authorization records for any armor in this sector. And yet Cricket agreed. The firefight on the eastern ridge lasted 11 more minutes. That sounds short. It was not short in the way that matters, which is in the experience from the inside way, the way where 11 minutes is a country you live in with its own geography and weather and rules of physics. But by military standards, against the force that had arrived, 11 minutes was generous. The enemy on that ridge had dug in with the confidence of people who knew the terrain and knew the opposing force's limitations and had correctly calculated that help was too far away to matter. They hadn't calculated for armor. Nobody on that ridge had calculated for armor. Armor wasn't supposed to exist in this sector. The terrain alone should have made it impossible. The mountain approaches, the grade, the surface conditions. What the enemy had been told, what any reasonable tactical analysis would have concluded, was that wheeled and foot movement, only single-digit vehicle access at best, no heavy assets, not here, not through those ridges. The 4 Abrams tanks that were currently turning the tactical situation completely inside out had apparently not received this analysis. The ridge went quiet at 0641. Not the negotiating kind of quiet, not the reloading kind, the final kind. Rourke stood up from the stream bed. He rolled his neck, which popped in 3 places, and he took in the valley. The orange signal panels were still spread on the bank behind him. The sky was full blue now, the sun clear of the eastern ridge hitting the dust that hung over the valley in a way that made it look almost pretty if you were the kind of person who could look at a place where a great deal of violence had just occurred and see the light. Rourke was, complicated as it was, that kind of person. You had to be. Otherwise, honestly, you kept carrying everything you saw and eventually you couldn't carry anything else. The lead Abrams stopped 40 meters from the stream bed. The turret hatch opened. The man who climbed out was not what Rourke expected. He was not a young soldier, not a captain coordinating a rescue operation, not a face that matched any of the archetypes Rourke's brain was reaching for. He was older, late 40s, maybe 50, with a gray shot beard that regulations technically prohibited and apparently nobody had gotten around to telling him about. He wore the rank of a lieutenant colonel, but moved like someone for whom rank was a filing system rather than an identity. He dropped off the tank hull to the ground with the easy economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times and didn't need to think about it anymore. He walked to Rourke. He looked at the orange panels, which he looked at the eastern ridge, quiet now and smoking slightly. He looked at Rourke's 2 wounded men who were being reached by the dismount's medic, and he watched the medic work for a moment with an assessing eye. Then he looked at Rourke. Chief Petty Officer Rourke. Not a question. He knew the name already. That's me, Rourke said. And you're Garrison, the man said, which we should talk. Not here. Rourke had been in special operations for 18 years. He had dealt with every variety of military authority, intelligence community liaison, interagency coordination, and chain of command complexity that the post-9/11 world had produced. He was not, as a professional matter, easily surprised by the appearance of entities he hadn't been briefed on. He was surprised now. Look, men are being extracted, Garrison said. 2 birds inbound, ETA 12 minutes. Your TBH, wounded, will go first. And the rest of us? Garrison looked at him with the particular patience of a man who has had a version of this conversation before and knows how it ends. The rest of you will have a choice to make. That was how it started. What Rourke learned in the next 6 hours, in a series of conversations that took place in a forward operating location that did not appear in any mission brief he had ever received, was partial and carefully edited and presented to him in the sequence that Garrison had apparently decided was the right sequence, which was the sequence of someone who knew how to brief a man like Rourke, meaning give him the tactical picture first, then the operational picture, then the part that requires him to make a decision in that order, because a man like Rourke needs to understand the shape of the problem before he can be trusted to choose correctly within it. The tactical picture. The compound had been cleared not recently, but months ago. The intelligence that had generated the mission had been fed deliberately. The 60-plus fighters on the eastern ridge had been positioned in the 3 days prior to the insertion. The jammer at the compound had been the mechanism by which the rescue window had been controlled. Not to prevent help from arriving, but to control when it arrived and from what direction. This took Rourke a moment to fully process. The jammer was theirs. The jammer was theirs. But it also blocked our communications. Yes, so they controlled both sides of the timeline. They did. Rourke sat with this, which means someone on our side gave them the timeline. Garrison didn't answer, which was its own answer. The operational picture was larger and uglier and had tentacles that reached into places Rourke's clearance level didn't technically cover, which Garrison either didn't know or didn't care about because he covered them anyway. There was, for what it's worth, a network, not new, not recently constructed, but old and patient and operating through channels that had been trusted long enough to become invisible. The compound wasn't the target. The man the intelligence said was in the compound was a fiction, a name attached to a purpose, the purpose being to generate this mission, this timeline, this valley. They wanted to capture your team, Rourke said. Some of your team, Garrison corrected. In particular, you, basically Cricket, and specifically Hawkins. The TBH, others were acceptable losses in their accounting. Rourke looked at Garrison for a long time. Why those 3? Because those 3 were in Ramadi in 2008. And what happened in Ramadi in 2008 is something some people would like to ensure stays in 2008. There it was, Ramadi. The night Rourke didn't discuss with anyone, including his therapist, including himself. He, to be fair, stood up from the table. He walked to the window, which looked out on a landing strip cut into the mountain plateau, dusty and rough and serviceable. He put his hands on the windowsill and looked at the strip and did not look at Garrison and said nothing for approximately 90 seconds. "Who are you?" he said finally. Not a question either. "I'm someone who has been watching this network for 2 years, Garrison said. "I'm someone who received your broken transmission fragment. Not the piece Cricket received, a different piece, a piece that came through on a frequency your radio isn't supposed to be able to reach on its standard configuration, which means whoever configured your radios for this mission made a modification that nobody briefed. Cricket's radio. Yes. Someone modified Cricket's radio to transmit on a frequency you monitor. Someone who wanted us to receive your position, yes. Someone on our side. Someone on our side, Garrison said. And that person is the reason you're alive, and also the reason I can't tell you who they are, because they're still inside the network, and they're more useful there than they'd be extracted." Rourke turned from the window. He looked at Garrison, at the gray beard and the old eyes and the rank that was a filing system. "What's the choice you mentioned?" Your team is being extracted. Full mission debrief, standard channels, FOB to JSOC. The official report will reflect a direct action mission that encountered an unexpected threat, was assisted by a coalition asset operating in the area, and was successfully extracted with minimal casualties. Garrison paused. That is one choice. And the other. You, Cricket and Hawkins, stay. You come with me. We finish this. The network, the source of the intelligence leak, the thing that happened to Ramadi in 2008, that someone is willing to construct a 60-man ambush in a forgotten valley to keep buried. Garrison looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy, but was adjacent to it. You go home, this happens again, and maybe not to you. Probably not to you, but to someone. And the sort of thing in Ramadi stays buried. Rourke thought about Torres touching his pocket photograph twice. Thought about Briggs doing everything right and looking appropriately terrified. Thought, well, about Cricket's Shreveport laugh that filled a room when he let it go, and the way he almost never let it go. He thought about Ramadi. He sat back down. Tell me about the network, he said. Garrison opened a folder. And this right here was where the mission that nobody would ever officially acknowledge actually began. Not in the valley with the orange panels and the 60 guns. Not in the stream bed with the bad math and the 18 minutes. Not in the empty compound with the repainted walls. Here, in a room on a mountain plateau, with a folder on a table and a man with a gray beard and a choice that wasn't really a choice for a man built the way Rourke was built. The tank that had come over the western ridge hadn't come from any base on any map. The unit that crewed it did not exist on any organizational chart. The operation that had sent it to that valley had been authorized by exactly one person, whose signature on the authorization was written in a code that would dissolve into an administrative error if anyone tried to trace it. But it had come, which in that mattered, because in the accounting of that day, when the math had stopped working and the options had run out and 11 men were in a stream bed with orange panels spread like a last resort prayer to the sky. Something had heard the prayer. Something had, I think, done the impossible mathematics of 4 tanks through terrain that couldn't support 4 tanks, arriving in a window that was measured in minutes on either side of the margin, and it had answered. The question that Rourke was sitting down to understand was, what kind of something does that? And what does it want in return? Outside, the first extraction helicopter was landing. He could hear it through the wall, the rotor wash, the dust. He thought about Torres getting on that helicopter. He, I think, thought about Briggs getting on that helicopter. He thought about the photograph in the left breast pocket and what it meant that Torres had touched it twice and whether Torres knew what that meant. He hoped Torres didn't know. He turned his attention back to the folder. Garrison began to talk. The folder contained 47 pages. Rourke read all of them twice. Plus, Cricket read them once very fast in the way Cricket consumed information, scanning, categorizing, retaining everything the same way he worked a radio band, hunting for the signal in the noise. Hawkins received a verbal summary from Rourke because Hawkins did not read documents. Hawkins listened. He sat in the corner of the room with his arms across his chest and his eyes on the middle distance, and he listened. And when Rourke finished, he said 5 words, which was an unusually long contribution from Hawkins. How many people know this? Garrison looked at him, including, honestly, you 3 and 11. Hawkins nodded once. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hands, and he looked at Garrison with the kind of look that a man gives when he's deciding whether he trusts something and hasn't yet decided. Then he looked at Rourke. Rourke gave him nothing back. Rourke had made his decision already, and he was not going to make it for anyone else. Hawkins said one more word. Okay, that was it. That was the deliberation. 3 men in a room on a mountain plateau, 2 of them veterans of the thing in Ramadi, and one of them new to the full picture of it, but present for the consequences, and between the 3 of them, a grand total of 6 words of discussion before they agreed to disappear into an operation that didn't officially exist. The thing in Ramadi. Rourke hadn't spoken, to be fair, of it in 4 years. Not to his, for what it's worth, ex-wife, who had asked directly and gotten silence so complete it became its own kind of answer. Not to the Navy therapist who had the right clearance and the patient voice and the official purpose of helping him process the weight of what the job accumulated over time. Not to Cricket, who had been there, who had seen what Rourke had seen, who carried the same weight in a different pocket and dealt with it through the same mechanism. Not silence in Cricket's case, but noise, the Shreveport laugh deployed like a signal flare against the dark. In Ramadi in 2008, a decision had been made. Not by Rourke alone, and not by Cricket, not by Hawkins. Made above them, by someone with stars on his collar, and the authority to make the kind of decisions that get filed under a classification so deep that the existence of the classification is itself classified. A decision that saved a certain kind of asset and cost something else, something that Rourke's conscience had been paying the installments. On for 4 years, in the small hours of the morning, when sleep stopped working and the ceiling became something to stare at. What Garrison's folder told them was that the man who had made that decision in Ramadi was still making decisions. Different geography, different resources, same calculus. The calculus of the person who decides what's expendable and who, and at what price. He had built the network around himself the way some men build walls. Quietly, over time, with materials that didn't look like walls while they were being assembled. He had people inside the intelligence community, inside contracting organizations, inside chains of command that touched both military and civilian authority. He had money that moved through structures designed not to be followed and information that moved through people designed not to be noticed. And he had apparently been watching Rourke for long enough that when an opportunity arose to resolve what he considered an outstanding liability, the 3 men who had been in Ramadi, who knew what the decision had been, and who had made it, he had constructed an entire operation around that resolution. Basically a mission brief. For what it's worth, a false intelligence product, plus 60 fighters in a valley, a jammer, a timeline, the kind of planning that requires resources, the kind of resources that require authority, plus the kind of authority that, when you trace it, tells you something about how far up the rot goes. This was what Garrison had been mapping for 2 years. This, in my opinion, was why 3 tanks had come over a ridge that tanks weren't supposed to be able to cross. The operation they were being asked to join had one objective: get close enough to the man to document the network completely. Every node, every name, every financial channel, every communication pathway, and deliver that documentation to the one entity Garrison believed could act on it without being absorbed by it. He wouldn't name the entity. He said this not as evasion, but as operational security, and Rourke believed him. Because a man who evades sounds different from a man who compartmentalizes, and Garrison was the second kind. What Garrison needed from the 3 of them was specific. Rourke, in my opinion, for planning and ground operations. Cricket for communications and signals intelligence. The modified radio had been a test, and Cricket had passed it without knowing he was taking the test. And Hawkins for one reason that Garrison stated plainly. There was one moment in the operation, one specific moment, where a decision would need to be made at range under conditions. That left no room for error. And Hawkins was the only person Garrison had identified in 2 years of looking who he trusted to make that decision correctly. Hawkins, when Garrison said this, said nothing, and which meant yes. They spent 3 days at the mountain plateau location. 3 days of planning, briefing, counter-briefing, map work, signal work, the slow construction of an operational architecture designed to exist in negative space. No footprint, no record, no signature that could be traced back to anything that would connect to them. To be fair, Garrison's people were good. Not military good in the conventional sense. Not the good you get from years inside a structure. Good, and I mean the other way, the way you get from years operating outside structures. From learning to think in the gaps between systems. From surviving in the administrative white space where no one is watching because no one believes anything is there. On the 4th day they moved. Plus, the man they were after, Garrison called him by a job title rather than a name, The architect, which was either dramatic or precise, depending on how literally you took it, was in a city, not a compound, not a valley, not a place that had the geographic vocabulary of what Rourke was trained for. A city meant cover and civilians and rules of engagement that were essentially just the concept of restraint applied under pressure and revised continuously as conditions changed. Rourke had operated, I think, in cities before. He had opinions about cities. The city did not care about his opinions. It was old, as cities in that part of the world are old, built over itself repeatedly across centuries, so that the modern street grid sat on top of Ottoman-era foundations, that sat on top of something older still, and the result was an urban landscape that was simultaneously navigable and labyrinthine, familiar in its bones and treacherous in its surface. The architect had offices there, legitimate offices, in legitimate buildings, associated with legitimate business concerns that weren't in fact legitimate, but were very convincingly dressed. He moved, through the city with a pattern that garrison surveillance had mapped over 18 months. Predictable in his unpredictability, which was its own kind of pattern. Cricket spent the first 2 days inside a rented space on the 3rd floor of a building with sight lines to 4 of the architect's known communication nodes, building a signals picture that would have taken a full NSA team a week to construct. He did it in 48 hours, and he did it quiet, running on bad coffee, and the kind of focused intensity that Rourke recognized as Cricket in his highest gear. Not the laugh, not the noise, but the absence of both, the pure signal that meant Cricket had found the frequency that mattered and was locked onto it hard. What actually Cricket found changed the picture. The documentation that Garrison had been building for 2 years was good. It was thorough, and it was damning, and it pointed clearly at the architect as the center of a network that had done specific illegal things in specific places at specific times. But it was circumstantial in the way that things constructed from the outside looking in are always circumstantial, strong, but not ironclad, not the kind of thing you could put in front of the right people and be certain of the outcome, because the right people existed inside institutions that the architect had spent years making sure were partially his. What Cricket found was the inside record. The architect kept one, not out of arrogance, not exactly, out of the same logic that makes certain powerful people keep tap into, because information is the hardest currency, and the habit of collecting it, even on yourself, even on your own decisions, is how you maintain control over the narrative. The record was encrypted and distributed across 3 separate systems and designed to be inaccessible to anyone who didn't have all 3 access keys simultaneously. Cricket had 2 of them within the first 18 hours. The third took until 0300 on the second night. And when he got it, he didn't celebrate, because Cricket in his highest gear didn't celebrate. He just added the result to the picture and kept building. Rourke read what, in my opinion, Cricket had assembled at 0500 on day 3. He sat with it for a long time. Garrison sat across from him and watched him read and said nothing, because Garrison had apparently already read it and understood what reading it did to a person. The decision in Ramadi, and it was there, not described in the soft language of operational necessity, not filtered through the euphemisms that such decisions accumulate when they are written by people who made them. Written plainly, honestly, in the architect's own internal notation, which stripped euphemism away because the internal record was never meant to be seen. And the architect had apparently decided that in his private accounting, he would be precise. Precision was, from what Rourke could reconstruct of the man, of value. What had happened to Ramadi was that a source, a human intelligence asset, someone who had been inside a network that predated the architect's network by a decade, someone who had taken years to develop, and whose information had been reliable, and whose safety had been guaranteed by the chain of command that Rourke and Cricket and Hawkins had been part of, had been deliberately exposed. Sold, essentially, though the accounting didn't use that word. Traded. The architect had needed something from the opposing network. The something had been obtained. The source had been the price. The source had died. And the 3 men who had known the source, who had worked alongside the source, who had been present for the promise of safety that had been made, and then deliberately broken, those three men had been, in the architect's private accounting, a liability, a manageable one for 4 years. And then, when circumstances had changed, an urgent one, Rourke put the documents down. He sat for a while with the ceiling and his hands and the particular quality of 0500 light in a city that was waking up around them in layers, the call to prayer already threading through the streets from 3 directions, the sound of it entering the room through the single window they kept cracked for air circulation. He was not angry. He had expected to be angry. He had the old familiar feeling of reaching for it, the sweet familiar thing, the tool that steadied him, and finding that it wasn't there this time. In its place was something quieter and heavier and more final. Not grief exactly, not rage, something that had no name that he knew. The emotion you arrive at when you've carried a thing for 4 years without knowing its exact shape, and then someone puts it in front of you with the corners filled in. He picked the documents back up. "Is it enough?" he said. "Yes," Garrison said, with the signals intelligence cricket built. "Yes, and it is enough." For what? For it to matter. For it to go somewhere it can't be swallowed. Rourke thought about that. Thought about institutions and the ways they protected themselves and the ways they were porous and the ways that information sent to the right, placed in the right form at the right time, could do the thing that information is supposed to do, which is change what happens next. He thought about Torres, about the photograph in the left breast pocket, about a man who had been extracted by helicopter 4 days ago and was somewhere now, living the forward life of a continuing person, not knowing what Rourke now knew. He decided that Torres didn't need to know. Some weights could be carried by fewer people. That was a service. "Hawkins," he said. Hawkins was in the corner. He looked up. The moment Garrison described. "When is it?" Garrison answered. "Look, tomorrow. Produce 1400. He moves between locations on a fixed schedule on the 3rd Thursday of the month. Has done for sort of 11 months, and the route passes a position that Hawkins doesn't need the full operational picture," Rourke said. "Hawkins needs the window, the range, and the condition." Garrison looked at Hawkins. Hawkins looked at Garrison with the same evaluating look as before, the same unfinished decision. "Look then, the look finished," Garrison told him. Hawkins nodded. He looked at his hands again. Honestly, he looked at Rourke. 2 words. "It's fine." It was, in fact, fine. That, well, was the thing about Hawkins. When Hawkins pretty much said it was fine the way that a measurement taken by a precision instrument is fine. Not approximate, not close enough, but exact. The shot TBH, the following afternoon at 13:47 local time, was exact. Rourke wouldn't describe it further, and neither would this account. Because honestly, the moment belongs to the 11 people who know about it, and that number won't be enlarged here. What happened after was quieter than what came before. The documentation reached the place Garrison had spent 2 years identifying as the right place by a mechanism. That Garrison had spent 2 years constructing for exactly this delivery. The network began to come apart. Not loudly, not in the way that networks come apart in movies with arrests and press conferences and the satisfying architecture of public accountability. Quietly, the way water finds the cracks in stone. People who had been operating within the network found themselves suddenly operating with less money, less cover, less certainty that the structure around them was intact. And people who operate with less certainty tend to make decisions that create more cracks. In my opinion, the process took months. It is in some ways still taking months. The architect's private record, with the Ramadi entry written plainly in his own notation, reached one additional destination that Garrison hadn't told Rourke about until it had already arrived. Basically, a family. Plus, a family that had spent 4 years without an explanation for a thing that had happened to someone they had loved, someone who had trusted a promise, someone whose ending had been recorded precisely in a private document by the man who had arranged it. The family now knew. Plus, not everything, but the shape of it. The corners filled in. Rourke learned about this afterward. He sat with the information for a while. He did not cry, which was not because he was incapable of crying, but because the weight of what he felt exceeded what crying was designed to carry. The way a container can be too small for what you're trying to put in it. He went back, which he and Cricket and Hawkins went back through channels that Garrison had prepared with a cover story that was plausible and a paper trail that supported it. And they returned to their unit and to their lives with the specific civilian texture of men who have done something that can't be discussed, which is a texture that the people around them recognized without being able to name it. Their teammates recognized it because they had versions of it themselves. Their superiors recognized it because they had produced it in others. Their families, in Rourke's case, ex-family, and in Cricket's case, a sister who was the only family that mattered, and in Hawkins's case, no family at all in any directory, recognized it as the latest installment of a thing that had been accumulating for years and would continue to accumulate, and was the price of a life, which was not a complaint, merely a reckoning. Rourke was honorably discharged 8 months later. The timing was his own choice. He had done a math one more time, and the math said that the thing he'd been doing for 18 years had arrived at a natural close. Not because he was finished with it, because actually it was finished with a certain version of him, and the version that remained was perhaps better deployed in the negative space Garrison had showed him, the administrative white space between systems where no one was watching. He took a civilian position. Plus, he won't say with whom. Cricket re-enlisted. He's still in. He still has the laugh. He deploys it less often than he used to, but when he deploys it, it still fills a room. Hawkins does not communicate his current status or location to anyone. This is consistent with his pre-existing communication style and shouldn't be read as significant. What should be read as significant? The thing that the official record does not contain. The mission brief did not anticipate, and the men on the eastern ridge hadn't calculated for, is simpler than the surrounding architecture makes it seem. 11 men were in a stream bed with the wrong math, and a last resort spread in orange on the bank. Something that wasn't supposed to exist in that sector came over the ridge and changed the math. And the reason it came was not bureaucratic, not protocol, not the activation of a QRF through proper channels in the expected window. It came because one person inside a network of people who were doing a wrong thing had decided quietly and at personal risk to do a right one, had modified a radio and had opened a frequency, had created the condition by which the impossible became possible. That person's name actually is not in this account. That person's name won't be in any account. That person is still inside, and that's the part of this story that matters most and will be talked about least. Not the tanks over the ridge, not the stream bed and the orange panels, not the valley and the math and the 18 minutes. But the person who sat inside the wrong thing and at a cost to themselves that this account can't begin to calculate, chose to route the signal through. In the end, every rescue is that, not the thing that arrives. The person who made sure it could.